Hello, this is my presentation on Australian printmaking and the relation it had with international politics and art. I'm just going to check that this is recording. Yes, it is. Good. Okay. I'd just like to, first of all, point out that I've used only male examples for this presentation because the other presentation this week was female Australian artists of the 1960s, and I didn't want to double up with that. Okay. The 1960s were a transformative decade for printmaking. Print was becoming an increasingly popular medium internationally, and Australia followed closely behind. However, there is a crucial element missing from a large portion of Australian printmaking for much of this period. There was a certain cultural essence missing from many of the works to come out of this period. There is a common assertion, pushed notably in Sacha Grishin's 1994 book, Contemporary Australian Printmaking, that the 1960s were a period in which Australian print found its feet and broke away from reliance on the culture of America and Britain, finding, quote, creative vitality, unquote, internally. However, the prints of some of the 1960s most prolific printmakers seem too often culturally indistinct. Tate Adams, John Brack, and Fred Williams are some of the most major artists in 1960s Australian printmaking, but much of their work lacks cultural specificity. Other important artists to come out of this period of Australian art made prints which were unmistakable cultural ruminations, but not on Australia. The prints of Udo Selback are some of the most important to come out of this period, as he heartbreakingly expressed his experience in the Second World War. Despite Selback's prominence in the country, his prints are completely foreign to the Australian experience. Much of this lack of cultural expression can be attributed to the rise of abstract expressionism. But similarity between nations is another factor. With this in mind, the assertion that the 1960s was a time in which Australian print broke away from the cultural dependence on America and the United Kingdom it had relied on before seems an overly bold claim. One artist who helped Australian print take off in the 1960s was Tate Adams. Adams was an Irish-born printmaker who rose to prominence through his brooding, abstract liner cuts. His work is dark and quite often personally confronting. Despite his popularity as an Australian printmaker, his work doesn't seem to reflect any essence of the nation. His 1962 work, Clown, is one such example. The piece is so abstract that culture is completely irrelevant, as it favours figurative expression as much of his work did. This more abstract form of art, while only then beginning to find its feet in Australia, was already well established in the United States. Another Australian artist who worked in print in the 1960s was John Brack. Brack was predominantly a painter, but began a print practice as the medium was taking off in Australia. In 1954, Brack produced a work titled Third Daughter, a clever depiction of a petulant child. Author Pat Gilmore makes the point in a review of Grisham's contemporary Australian printmaking that, quote, the child could have been raised anywhere, unquote. Certainly, the emphasis on the print is the emotions of the little girl. This emotional and personal focus is a clear thematic reoccurrence in Brack's work. His depiction of Australia focuses on its people, but in such a way that he captures nothing specifically Australian about them. Some of the most profound effects on Australian printmaking were made by people who lived and worked on the other side of the world. Udo Selback was a German artist who lived in Germany until the 1950s. Selback's work is haunted by his conscription to the Russian front in order to bar Stalin's march on Berlin. Narrowly escaping execution, Selback immigrated to South Australia and began a hugely fruitful career. He was even a founding member of the Print Council of Australia. Selback's prints are expressions which stem from a very specific time and place, one so separate from Australian existence that his 1960s prints should hardly be considered Australian at all. The only element of comparison between Selback's work and the Australian culture is World War II, which is completely irrelevant considering that Selback fought for the Germans in a theatre of war in which Australia did not participate. Despite the deeply poignant and personal nature of his art, Selbach's perspective is entirely foreign to Australian culture. This quote here is from a German officer quoted by Max Hastings in his famous World War II book, Inferno World at War, and it gives you an idea of the conditions that Selbach would have had to fight in Russia when he was there. The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. One of the examples of an artist whose visual language was built on a uniquely Australian image was Fred Williams. Williams was a painter and a printmaker whose landscapes continued a tradition begun by painters like Arthur Streeton, Tom Roberts, and Hans Huyssen. Williams' work is much more abstract than these predecessors, and in his painting it is easy to recognise the distinct features of the Australian landscape. However, in Williams' print work, these features are much less recognisable. While Williams does attempt to capture the unique rhythms of the untamed Australian bushland, when compared to his paintings, there is no competition as to which better encapsulates the sense of Australian reality. His engraving, Echuca Landscape, is certainly a shadow of the sparse Victorian bush, but in terms of light, space, and especially colour, the land is much more soulfully portrayed in paintings like Upwey Landscape. There are two primary reasons why cultural expression is so peripheral in 1960s Australian print. Firstly, as modern art progressed, it moved further and further into abstraction and away from the limitations the artistic periods which had preceded it placed upon art. The world of printing was not exempt from this shift of focus, meaning cultural expression, even in subtext, was not in demand. Such cultural expression was most popular in years before, when print was considered a much more practical art form. The first printings ever done in Australia, done by John Lewin, were a rendering of the natural world unique to Australia. Lewin produced books filled with etching of Australia's natural specimens. I'm sorry, I forgot to change slides to show you. Yep. Lewin produced books filled with etchings of Australia's natural specimens. It follows that if the country's printmaking practice was begun through a capturing of its essence in natural culture, the rebellious nature of modern art would leave such ideals in the past. This was one of John Lewin's original prints, engraving and etching, the spotted grosbeak. The second reason is that in the 1960s, many of the broad strokes of Australian culture were all too similar with England and the United States, especially the latter. Australia and America, both originally British colonies, were in the grips of historically significant internal and external struggles. Both were involved in the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War, much to the chagrin of those attempting to adopt the American mantra of free love and peace. This movement was also at odds with the persistent, racist laws and contributed to their abolishment in both countries almost simultaneously. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson abolished the Jim Crow laws that had been keeping African Americans in the South from participating in society in any meaningful way. Only 2 years later would Australia undergo a referendum which saw stunning support to recognise Indigenous Australians as people under the Constitution. Additionally, there were roughly 200 years between the first settlement and constitutional recognition of Native people's rights in both Australia and America. The two nations were similar enough so that when the waters were muddied by the rise of abstract art, Australian print often failed to distinguish itself from its big brother. Artistically, this similarity manifested itself strongly. In the 1960s, Australian prints scarcely used cultural imagery specific enough to be without qualification a recognisable motif. Brack's third daughter may have been pouting at injustices to minorities in Memphis or in Melbourne. Similarity, when paired with abstraction, results in culturally indistinct form of art. Australian printmakers generally chose instead to favour artistic experimentation with varying degrees of vagueness of form. Those Australian artists who did choose to focus more on a specific time and place did not often choose Australia. The assertion that Australian printmaking in the 1960s broke a precedent to become something specifically Australian ignores the solid international foundation that printmakers at the time did not always truly try to break away from. Thank you very much.